celebrate Veterans Day today. I know this isn't normally the Eastern Mennonite University observed holiday. We appreciate you all taking the time to observe with us.
Most of you know we've been hanging 22 dog tags on the tree out there. I know some of you have participated in that at noon every day to represent the 22 veterans a day who commit suicide. This is all veterans, different ages, some active duty stuff. So tonight we want to just talk not just specifically about suicide, but about like why is there such a high rate of suicide among veterans? Like what challenges are they facing? So the way we're going to do this, I'm a graduate student at Study Veterans Building. Most of you know that probably, but some of you might not. And I've been doing some of my research this semester on veteran integration, especially post U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I'm going to present on that a little bit. And
I'm also a graduate student at Peace Building. Probably most of you know, because we've gotten to know this press lately, is that I'm also a veteran, and I served 3 years, 9 months, 6 days in the U.S. Navy. I got out August 6th. All I wanted to do when I got out was come to the Center for Justice and Peace Building, and walked off my boat August 6th, and I was in Harrisonburg later that day. A week later, I was in classes. So it's been a really supportive, great environment in terms of my integration. However, many men and women aren't quite so lucky to have such a great homecoming. If I could for a second, I'd like to thank my wife, Mary Beth. Big thank you, wife. But again, many men and women aren't quite so lucky to have such a great, supportive environment for a great home life. Trina,
yeah, well, so I was going to present a little more of my research. Michael might tell us some first, and then just a little bit. So thinking in your mind throughout while we're presenting some of these things, think if there's any stories you have from your own experiences that you would like to share, or reflections or thoughts or questions. So we're going to open up the mic after we get our little dealio and give you guys a chance to talk. So is it on? I'm really bad at the audio button. All right. All right, I wanted to first of all start out today with just kind of acknowledging who I am in this whole picture. I'm not a veteran. I don't come from a military family at all. In fact, my family background is Mennonite. And I remember, can everybody hear me? Okay, cool. I'd rather yell from here than big about things. So, my family background is Mennonite, and with a lot of my extended family and growing up, I always felt some level of uncomfortability in even talking about the military, and yet I felt also that there was something inherently wrong about that. Like the activism that I experienced as a child was this kind of negation identity, like, oh, there's the military and here we are, and it was kind of like based on fear. And I know a lot of pacifists have really great, strong identities, but that was just the kind of identity I experienced. And I think what made it hard for me to know how to approach the topic. But in the last 2 years, I've had several friends who have joined the military, have been deployed, and I've just become a lot more aware. I wanted to share one brief story to describe why I'm wearing this today to honor a particular veteran, and then I'll get into some of my research. So when I was a child, one of the first veterans that I remember as a teenager was this old man named Mr. Metz up my street, and he was a Navy veteran, and he had been in the World Wars. And when I was a kid, I was 10 years old, and I would dress up in these crazy costumes because I like to do that, and bring my little basket up and buy vegetables from this guy because he was a gardener. And I realized later he was kind of the center of our community. All the kids would go and play in his yard, and the last time I saw him before he died was in college, and he gave me this cross that he had gotten in the Pacific during the World Wars. And I'm just sharing that story because I think that Mr. Metz had a place in my community growing up and in my neighborhood, and everyone really valued him, and he had this good work that he was doing with gardening. And I think that some veterans, not all, but some veterans feel like they don't have that. But I think it's really important for us to realize that who better do we have to learn the ways of peace than people who know the ways of who have experienced war. So my research this semester has been exploratory research. I want to be upfront with that right away. Some of it was inspired by STAR, if you've heard of that, Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience over in, some of you are doing that this week, the STAR Level 2. So I went to the Journey Home from War workshop earlier this year, so some of that's inspired by this, and then I've also done some of my own interviews. I've read a lot of books, done some of my own research. It's exploratory. I'm not trying to say that I know everything about this topic by any means. I have asked permission for everyone I interviewed, so anything I'm sharing from interviews is with permission today. I want you to know that as well. So, first of all, I want to just kind of give a place of where, when I was involved with veterans, specifically post-Iraq and Afghanistan. I'd like to say, for those of you who aren't aware of different conflict analysis mapping, that I didn't put my name up there just on a little ego trip or anything. We're required to place ourselves, when we're studying conflict, to place ourselves within where we fit in it, so that we understand that we aren't outside of and above conflict, but where our own connections are. So this, again, this is not every veteran experiences this exact relationship, but these are some of the trends that I noticed in my research. So veterans have lots of different connections with lots of different sectors of society. The in red here are different government kind of affiliations. Blue is more other veterans. The green represents American society, civilian life, and the yellow is potential psychological help. So here you have really strong, represent strong bonds between veterans and other veterans, especially if they've been in combat together. But other areas that are a little bit broken. The veterans and the Department of Veteran Affairs, there's some areas of conflict there because, well, I'll get into some of that later. There's also potential conflicts in military families. This line here represents misunderstanding between, again, I'll get more of this in more detail later, but this kind of gives you an overall picture of it. Misunderstandings between a lot of veterans and the American society. And one other thing I want to point out with this particular mapping of it that I think is really useful is this idea that for these particular wars, Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom, that we've been fighting in for 10 years, we're still in Afghanistan right now, is the United States government and the United States military has both had an influence on what the media has been able to portray in the war, and I think that that's a really crucial part of this. I know that a study was done a few years ago that only 4% of the media coverage was about Afghanistan. There was a sense that that we're fighting this war, but it's been forgotten by a lot of people, and part of it is just it's not made aware. The government has said the Bush administration didn't allow coffins to be shown of U.S. Veterans, service members, and so to promote the war effort, and a lot of just different restrictions on where media could go, and as a result, that's influenced American society to have some perhaps misperceptions or just ignorance about what's going on in the war, which contributes to a misunderstanding between a lot of veterans and society. So I just want you to get that picture of that right away. I also want to point out, I decided to include on the stakeholder map Iraq and Afghanistan because even though a lot of Iraq and Afghan people are not necessarily here right now present for this particular Afghan veteran reintegration, a lot has happened with veterans and people from these places, and that lives on for a lot of veterans in their minds after they come back. And there's been broken ties there, and I think that that is extremely important within this whole picture to acknowledge. So, I wanted to, this is an identity wheel mapping that I did to kind of show some different statistics about who comprise the actual service members and veterans from these two particular wars, Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom. The different, down here I wrote where the information comes from. It's from some studies in 2007, 2009, so this particular isn't completely current, but it's a snapshot of a particular time in the war. I would like to, let's see, so there's a majority of men, but there have been some women. There's different regiments there, and I'd like you to notice the high level of percentage of personnel with children, and also the high level of personnel who are married, and the average age. So all these things are a little bit higher than in Vietnam or in previous wars, and I think that's really important for us to recognize. So what I did with this, when I did my research, I wanted to put out these statistics, but I think that it's really important to go a little bit beyond that when you're thinking about the identity of veterans. And so I did something a little different with this identity wheel to do this kind of dynamic identity mapping. So I want to explain a little bit of this beside each other. The idea here is I picked out certain factors that surfaced in my research that were particularly affecting the level of difficulty for veterans in this particular reintegration. And I want to first say that there could definitely be other, like my research I didn't have the capacity within this particular study to look at race and sexual orientation as to how that influenced, but I didn't see it as something that surfaced a lot. That doesn't mean that service members didn't have a harder time because of that, so I just want to acknowledge that might have made some service members' lives a lot more difficult, but that was a little bit beyond the scope of this particular study in terms of these things. So what I want to point to is this idea of experiential factors and narrative elements that form a conflict of identity for a lot of veterans when they return. And first of all, I want to look at the experiential factors. I think it's really important to understand that for this particular war, this was a volunteer army. The draft was abolished post-Vietnam, and as such, the United States had to do a lot of interesting things to make sure that we had enough troops that were deployed. There were longer deployments, more deployments, and we also, and this is why I put military branch on here, we drew from the National Guard to be deployed overseas, which was not historically the case. And so for several veterans, if 9/11 happened and they're like, okay, I want to serve my country, and then sign up for the National Guard, thinking that you're going to be staying on the homeland and then end up going abroad, that could be a real different of expectations, which could contribute in some sense to a higher degree of trauma experience. So also with the volunteer army, that kind of leads back to the statistics that we had before of a lot of these people were older, more were married, and more had children with this army. So that means the effects of the war, not just on veterans, but on their families, was a lot bigger in some senses. Let's see, I put gender up here because a lot of women have had to deal with military sexual trauma, which is really tragic. So not trauma that not necessarily came from combat, but from having sexual assault in the military. There's a really high level of that, which is very important, fortunate. And negation, I put that in the sense of, from some of my interviews with a few different veterans, it sounded like some veterans had a sort of either political identity or an identity of cleanness or something about like, oh, I am not this, and so I am this. Kind of like what I was talking about, the pacifist identity at the beginning. I won't go more into that, but I think it's more important here, and this is kind of an idea we got from the Journey Home from War conference, so I want to own where that came from, is the idea of monster warrior, like, it's kind of the self-narrative. That's why I put it under narrative element. When a veteran returns, he or she may wonder, may contemplate their different actions and think, wow, did I do something really great, or am I an awful person because of some of the things I have done? And that kind of tearing apart of the self, and that's why I put this idea of moral injury in the center. Maybe certain people had certain things in their conscience, or they really wanted to live and believe a certain way, but then they ended up not doing that, and that kind of creates this tear and this wound, and especially if this is done repeatedly and in service of one's country, it can become really confusing and complicated. And that's why I put American on here too, because a lot of these men and women signed up to serve. What does service look like when the liability is unlimited? So that's kind of, I think for me, that speaks to a lot of the heart of what's going on for a lot of veterans that makes reintegration really difficult, because there's all these things going on inside of trauma. So this is a pillar mat diagram. It kind of goes along with, I corresponded the colors mostly, and then I flip-flopped to accidentally kind of, so so the society green and the psychological stuff yellow on both, but military is red there, and veteran stuff is blue, and then here, veteran trauma is red, and military is blue. So sorry for that color identity confusion. But
Sorry, the color's on people can't see.
so I wanted to, so what kind of the effect of what makes reintegration all hard, like I was talking about with the identity mapping, at the heart of it is a lot of trauma experience. And sometimes that is in a conflict of identity, sometimes it's not. Such as, well, okay, so there's trauma, and then there's an inability in many ways of actually gaining access to the proper psychological support. Then there's the kind of trauma spills out into the family and society, which doesn't necessarily understand. And then there's the whole arena of the culture shock, which I think is a really good way of understanding of coming out of the military back into civilian life. It's a whole different world. But so to start with trauma and give kind of an overview of this. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, I put this here partly because the initials fit, but partly, but I want to just say that some people don't like calling it post-traumatic stress disorder because it pathologizes what is otherwise a normal reaction to experiences of high trauma. But nonetheless, post-traumatic stress, there's a lot of that exists. There's also traumatic brain injuries that can cause trauma. Furthermore, if veterans are really close with their combat units and then some of those people get hurt or they get torn apart about coming back, that's like their family being ripped apart, so that causes trauma. And then the other two I'd like to point out, which kind of goes back to the identity mapping thing, is, and the original stakeholder map, is the idea of actions in Iraq and Afghanistan, like the moral questionability. There's a great quote in this book by, I probably couldn't find the page, so I should probably not try. But there's a book by Rita Brox called Soul Repair, and in it she says that it's not until after the symptoms of PTSD kind of disappear a little bit, and then all the moral questions arise about what should I have done here or there. And I think that is really complicated by, I know I read, for this research, I read this thing about Iraq veterans against the war who were testifying against war crimes, and some of them were talking about how the war was like, these veterans considered it a war of aggression, which goes against the Geneva Convention, or where there's really blurred lines between civilians and combat people on the actual grounds, especially like with women and children. Like some of them seem to like throw grenades or at people, and so then soldiers would fire back, and so it created all these moral dilemmas, basically. And so that can just be a form of trauma, which can either, just be witnessing that or participating in it. Participatory trauma is a kind of trauma, and the sense of betrayal. What if you signed on to your country to do something you really believed in, and then they betrayed what you thought their values are? So all of this contributes to trauma. And then the unfortunate thing is that it's very difficult for veterans to get the help they need. So I think this is all of these things contribute to why veterans might choose suicide, because all this inner conflict going on. But then, with all of these things, like towards the beginning of the war, the reentry and health, one of the veterans I interviewed was talking about how he just recently returned from Afghanistan, and he said that now the health systems are a lot better than they used to be in the military, but it's had 10 years of a war to learn and to have more psychologists and to recognize PTSD as something legitimate. And so towards the beginning of the war, that wasn't the case necessarily for veterans. Also, the Department of Veteran Affairs has the notorious perception among a lot of service members as just giving out pills or taking months to go over claims and just a lot of paperwork. It's very difficult for veterans to get their needs met through here necessarily. Also, there's stigma preventing the idea of actually going for mental health, and there's a lot of self-medication happening with alcohol and the wrong kind of pills and lots of different things. The other pillars I want to touch briefly on with what makes this reintegration so difficult is the actual coming out of military culture, which is hierarchical, based on a lot of structures, into a civilian world that's not necessarily like that. Going through environmental change from the barracks or a boat or whatever it may be, or the actual foreign country you were in, to coming back here, that's a big change. There's also employment if you stay in the military versus getting out of the military. And a lot of veterans have skills that are great for like military things, but not necessarily good for the civilian life. So So suddenly, like, your whole purpose and your whole way of being and everything, then feeling like there's not a place. That's why I showed you that story at the beginning about this veteran. This veteran had found a place, but I think a lot of veterans might not feel like they found a place. There's also this culture of silence within the military, especially with mission operative secrecy of, oh, you've got to like be confidential for the missions, but also there's a lot of jargon. And anyways, I think that this creates a mindset of secrecy about things that are not necessarily things you need to be secretive about, and which can really impact difficulties with reintegrating into society and family events. And so here on these two different sides, I put, for one, these are, like I showed you on the stakeholder map with the government and the military affecting the American people. This creates ignorance. There's also a big mythology of what war is and what war means that kind of creates distance between veterans coming back and civilians who don't know how to interact. I mean, I definitely felt like that. Even a year ago, I would say that. And that's partly why I've been doing this research, because I want to be able to get past these parts of me somehow to not be stuck there. There's also, in terms of family situations, family issues that make this difficult for a lot of veterans. One is just family changes and expectations. Like if you're gone for a long time and you come back and your kids have like grown up by like a year more, especially if you're little kids, that's a lot of change. You go through a lot of adjustments and changes, and so that can be really difficult. There's also the idea of intimacy and infidelity. This kind of surfaced a lot in research I did, that there's like a lot of, and this is not by any means across the board, but there's a lot of like cheating that goes on both ways when someone is deployed, potentially. And also, this whole idea of trauma can make intimacy really difficult upon return, which can also further impact just a difficult reintegration. So if you can just kind of see here, there's all this stuff going on inside of a lot of veterans, and not all veterans experience that. You know, not all veterans have been in combat. Even veterans who haven't been in combat may experience this. So there's a lot of this going on, and then it's really difficult to get the help you need for it, and then you have a society that doesn't understand, and then there's all these changes in your family, and the combat unit that you thought was your family isn't there with you anymore, so you feel alone, and then you're going through all of these changes about what is giving your life meaning and a sense of culture too. So there's a lot going on here. So if that can kind of, I think this is probably the most important part of what I was going to say tonight, if that kind of sets the stage for what makes this so difficult for a lot of veterans. So I just kind of put that there if you guys wanted to take a look for a second to see how they correspond, because that was really, making these diagrams was really helpful for me to kind of understand this whole, where all this stuff fits in. And another interesting thing about this generation is a lot of the veterans I interviewed had strong connections with other veterans, but not with veterans organizations, because there's a ton of politics involved in which veterans organizations do what things and go with what war, and which veterans like each other and which don't, and what happened with just a lot of politics, and is the government actually using these? One veteran told me he thought the government was using these as a way to suppress veterans from revolting back in the States with communist ideas, and by giving them cheap alcohol and all this stuff. So there's all these questions of politics and stuff like that that are going on here. So this kind of goes over what we've looked at so far. And then briefly, I wanted to also just note that along with the ignorance and myth that is in American society, the context of this, and I put this here because there's like a context coming out of the military going into civilian life. So there's a conflict of context going out. The ABC triangle is like context, attitudes, and behavior. So this particular one is for veterans. I've talked about some of this already, but I want to underline, and this is especially at present, we talked about this in Journey Home from Work workshop. It's in this book. I brought all these books I have about this in case any of you are interested in more information afterwards. This book, War in the Soul, it talks a lot about how, the Western culture just doesn't have a ritualistic place to welcome back. We don't know what to do with veterans. There's not a place for it, and I think that that's a really big problem, which is kind of why Michael and I wanted to do all of this, project and honor veterans with the dog tags and stuff, to start to create more of that kind of place. I wanted to point out here, too, that what happens with this is also what makes reintegration a lot more difficult for a lot of veterans, is like the attitudes that come out of because of experiencing certain kinds of trauma. There can be like, you've been in kill or be killed situations for so long, it creates black and white thinking. And cycles of trauma itself can make you really inward turned, and it make it be harder to empathize with other people. So that makes it hard when you're trying to fit back into your family. And the hypersensitivity, hyper-awareness, a lot of anxiety, suspicions, unresolved grief is a big one, I think. That there's just been, if you've been deployed multiple times, there's a lot higher risk for depression and other mental health problems. And with this higher risk of all of these things, if you go for help while you're deployed, they're going to try to make you, and one veteran was telling me this too, you're going to try to make you better enough that you can keep fighting, right? And stay there and not go back. And so I think a lot of things end up being suppressed, and then later, you keep drinking and all this stuff to kind of forget about it, and this grief never gets resolved. And part of that is that the American society doesn't recognize what's going on, and the government isn't going to. If the government has done questionable things, the government is probably not going to acknowledge it, which makes it difficult for veterans to have an opportunity to do that, which is tragic to me. And so these are some of the behaviors that veterans experience. A lot of that, not every veteran, like I said, a lot of it's trauma related, like acting in behaviors where you're just kind of putting all this negative energy into yourself, which can lead to suicide. Or acting out behaviors. I know one study I read talked about an increase in domestic violence for soldiers who had been deployed, not just soldiers, like service members who'd been deployed multiple times. There's also some sexual behaviors in terms of just like being hypersexual with a lot of random partners. And this isn't across the board. I know that happened a lot for Vietnam veterans as a way of just trying to make contact with reality somehow. There was this sense that reality had been shifted and what is here is no longer real. So you have to go and do really exciting things, or go and do risky things, or something to make you feel like you're still living in real life. So that's kind of what's happening in some of these. That aggressive driving, it can lead to a lot of crime. They need to have weapons all the time. There's all these different things that just make it's kind of an outgrowth of this, which in turn can make it really difficult for reintegrating into families, specifically. I had been looking at other stakeholders here, but I kind of cut it off so we can just look at veterans specifically. I want to point out here, I think that the most important things here are perhaps the interests and needs. Veterans can have a variety of positions depending on who they are and what they've been through. These are just some examples, but I think that there's a strong interest in self-protection and survival. And there's also this interest in connection, but also isolation, because there's been this betrayal of trust, or losing a lot of people that they cared about, potentially. Touching reality, like I just talked about. I think some needs are just safety and security, and I think that dignity is a really big need. We've been talking about that in some of my classes at the grad school, and the idea that acknowledgement is part of dignity. And I think that a big part of what's going on that makes this hard is that the American society and the government is not necessarily acknowledging, that we don't know how to acknowledge these people and what they have experienced, and know how to reintegrate and listen to them and learn from them. And there's also this idea of justice from this moral injury. How do you make right some of these things that have happened in war? And cohesive identity and purpose, and a trauma breakthrough process, which can begin with grief, but grief needs acknowledgement. So I think acknowledgement is a really key thing here. And yet, veterans can have a lot of different sources of power, including from their status as veterans, depending on how they get discharged from the military, they can get access to the GI Bill to have financial power, so they can go to college, they can have political power and influence their congressmen. And there's also, sometimes veterans use their military skills and expertise as contractors working for militaries, because that's one way they can kind of deal with that. But if veterans don't want to work for the military, again, it might make it hard for them to find their place. But I want to highlight here this idea of moral power. That's again an idea from Journey Home from War and from this book War in the Soul, that like, because of having gone through some of these really difficult experiences, there is a kind of wisdom that comes from that, and just a knowledge, and that itself can create the impetus for moral power to work. One veteran told me that he thinks the only way to deal with moral injury is to work for peace. That's really powerful. I mean, it means something when someone who's been through war wants to live in a different way to make right something. So that is an overview of my research. I hope I didn't go too crazy fast or anything, but I think that kind of lays this stage for some of the various things involved that make it so difficult for veterans coming back, especially here. I mean, this was just Iraq and Afghanistan. There's a whole different host of problems for Vietnam vets. And you know, the statistic about veteran suicide, 22 a day, a lot of those are older veterans. But you don't know they're going to commit suicide. You think they're fine, and then suddenly, out of the blue, I mean, that's a lot of the books I've read have had that kind of story. But there's all this stuff inside that other people don't know about. And suddenly it comes out. So this does not in any way say that all veterans have had this experience, but it is a way to start to understand and start to talk about it. So some of the barriers that make this so difficult can be broken down. There can be a more mutual understanding and working together instead of having like the falseness of a polarized identity. So.
Yeah, your research is excellent. And I'd just like to say, in my opinion, Katrina throughout our project has been concerned about her role as a civilian, whether she has agency to speak on these kind of matters. And I mean, obviously, there's a legal precedent for it. The military exists for what? For civil society. Who's the commander-in-chief? A civilian. So of course you have agency. Of course you can be here with this. I'd like to share some stories, some of my own experience with suicide in the military. Sure. Would you mind turning that off? I'm gonna.
Yes, sir.
Everyone's recording, please.